1958. Elvis Presley was the most famous man in the world. His manager had just built a $1 million empire. Then Elvis got drafted. Instead of accepting VIP service where he could keep performing, keep earning, keep his career intact, he made what seemed like a suicidal choice: serve as a regular soldier. He risked everything to prove something to himself. This is the price Elvis paid for his integrity. And what happened next destroyed the person he loved most. Let me tell you about a decision that confused everyone who knew Elvis. His friends didn't understand it. His manager was furious. His fans begged him to reconsider. Even his mother, the woman who believed in him before anyone else did, was terrified by what it meant. March 24, 1958. Elvis Presley received his draft notice. He was 23 years old and owned the world. 82% of America had watched him on Ed Sullivan. Teenage girls fainted at his name. Hollywood paid millions for his next picture. He was printing money. And then Uncle Sam called. Here's what nobody talks about. Elvis could have avoided this completely. He had options. Rich options. Safe options. Options that would have protected everything he'd built. But he chose none of them. And that choice tells you more about who Elvis really was than any song he ever recorded. Picture this. You're 23. 3 years ago, you were driving a truck in Memphis, barely making rent. Now you're the biggest star on the planet. Every decision you make prints money. Your manager, Colonel Tom Parker, has turned your face into a commodity. You're on lunchboxes. You're on lipstick. Radio stations build their entire format around your sound, and then you get a letter, United States Army. You are hereby ordered to report for induction. Most people don't know this, but Elvis had legitimate ways out. His lawyer could have fought it. Medical exemptions were available for people with far less influence than Elvis Presley. And here's the big one. The Army offered him special services. You know what that means? Keep performing. Entertain the troops. Basically continue your career in a uniform. Keep the money flowing. Keep the fame machine running. Stay Elvis. He said no. Let that sink in for a second. He said no to the easy path. No to the path that made financial sense. No to the path every advisor around him was screaming for him to take. Why? Because Elvis wanted to know something about himself, something that fame couldn't answer. Could he do hard things? Could he function as a regular person? Was he still real underneath all the screaming and gold records? Colonel Parker was reportedly furious, though he hid it from the cameras. He'd spent years building this empire, and now his golden goose was about to disappear for 2 years at the absolute peak of his earning potential. Movie studios panicked, RCA Records worried, fan clubs organized campaigns, begging the Army to find another solution. But here's what gets me. Elvis didn't just refuse special treatment. According to military records and the soldiers who served with him, he actively requested to be treated like everyone else. No special assignments, no celebrity perks, just another enlisted man doing his duty. Think about what that means. This wasn't a publicity stunt. If it was, he would have taken the special services assignment. That would have given him all the PR benefit of serving with none of the risk. But Elvis chose risk. He chose uncertainty. He chose to walk away from guaranteed success to test something in himself that money couldn't buy. The press went crazy. Photographers captured everything. His induction at the Memphis Draft Board. His famous haircut, when Army barbers took those carefully styled locks that teenage girls fantasized about. Front page news across America. Some newspapers treated it like a national tragedy. Others said it was about time Elvis learned some discipline. But nobody understood what was really happening. This wasn't about patriotism, though Elvis did love his country. This wasn't about image, though the colonel tried to spin it that way. This was about a young man who had become so famous so fast that he'd lost touch with reality. And he knew it. He felt it. That isolation. That separation from normal human experience. And it scared him. His mother, Gladys, was devastated. She had always been intensely close to her son. The idea of him going away, potentially going to combat, terrified her. Family members who were there during those final days before he shipped out remember Elvis reassuring her constantly. But he never wavered. He was going. He was serving. He wasn't hiding behind his celebrity. The Memphis Mafia, his crew of friends and constant companions, tried to make sense of it. Some got it immediately. They saw integrity in the choice. Others thought it was crazy, throwing away millions for principle. But Elvis told them something that stuck. He said being famous didn't make him different from any other American man his age. If other boys had to serve, so would he. He wanted to know if he could do it, if he could function outside the bubble. Listen, this wasn't rebellion. Elvis had done rebellion, that's what got him famous. This was something deeper. This was a young man suddenly aware of his own isolation from real life, choosing to reconnect by experiencing what millions of ordinary Americans experienced. This was Elvis trying to figure out if he was still a person underneath the legend. In those final days before Fort Chaffee, he recorded enough material for RCA to release during his absence. But musicians who worked those sessions noticed something different, a seriousness they hadn't seen before. Elvis wasn't just preparing professionally, he was preparing emotionally for complete transformation. Fort Hood, Texas, Private Presley, serial number 533107661. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, tank driver, then tank gunner. The work was brutal. The conditions were standard issue. The routine was identical to every other soldier. Here's what makes this extraordinary. Elvis didn't just serve, he served the hard way. Fellow soldiers interviewed years later tell the same story. Elvis refused preferential treatment even when officers quietly offered it. He lived in the barracks, ate the same food, followed the same schedule, did the same training. One sergeant told this story decades later. He got assigned to Elvis's unit expecting special handling instructions. None came. Just treat Private Presley like everyone else. So the sergeant watched him carefully, waiting for complaints. They never came. Elvis woke up at the same time, made his bunk to the same standards, did the same push-ups in the same mud as everyone else. You know what happened? The guys who initially resented him, who assumed he'd get special treatment, they started respecting him. Not because he was Elvis Presley, because he was willing to suffer with them, willing to be just another soldier struggling through the same miserable training. The press still followed him. Photographers still captured him in uniform. Fan magazines still published updates. But the army held boundaries. During duty hours, he was Private Presley. The military protected that. The physical transformation was real. Army training broke him down and built him back up. Soldiers remember him struggling initially with some of the demanding physical requirements, not complaining, just working, persistently, until he met the standards. But there was another transformation happening, an emotional one. Letters Elvis wrote during this period reveal loneliness and purpose wrestling inside him. He missed his mother intensely, missed performing, missed the creative expression that had defined his life. But he also wrote about feeling useful in a different way. About satisfaction from mastering skills that had nothing to do with entertaining people. His mother's health was getting worse. Gladys Presley had never recovered emotionally from Elvis being drafted. The separation destroyed her. She struggled with anxiety, depression. Her physical health declined. August 1958, still in basic training. Elvis got emergency leave. His mother was hospitalized with hepatitis and complications. He traveled to Memphis, spent time at her bedside. Family members say Gladys rallied when Elvis arrived, but she was clearly dying. Elvis requested an extension. The army granted it, but Gladys Presley died August 14, 1958, 46 years old. The grief was catastrophic. People who were there, who saw Elvis at the funeral, they described something that aged him overnight. He was 23 and had just lost the person who believed in him before the world did. The woman who sacrificed for his dreams, who loved him unconditionally through poverty and fame. At Graceland, thousands of fans gathered outside. Inside, Elvis collapsed with grief. This wasn't performance emotion. This was raw human suffering. And it happened while the world watched, while cameras waited, while newspapers prepared headlines about the famous singer's loss. Now Elvis had another choice. He could request hardship discharge. His father needed him. The army might have granted it given the circumstances and publicity, but Elvis chose to return to duty. He chose to complete his service. This decision, made in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death, that tells you everything about his character. He went back to Fort Hood carrying grief that would stay with him forever. But he went back, completed his training, and when the army announced his unit was deploying to Germany, Elvis prepared to go overseas, further from home, further from his career, further from everything familiar except the uniform and the duty he'd chosen. If stories like this, that reveal the human complexity behind the icon, matter to you, I hope you'll subscribe to The Man Behind the King. Germany, October 1958. Friedberg, 20 miles north of Frankfurt. Cold War. Soviet forces in East Germany. American soldiers maintaining readiness for potential conflict. This wasn't peacetime tourism. This was real military deployment during genuine international tension. Specialist fourth-class Presley. He'd been promoted. Normal progression for soldiers who demonstrated competence. His job, scout jeep driver for reconnaissance platoon. Work that required alertness, technical knowledge, functioning as part of a coordinated team. What happened in Germany is one of the least understood periods of Elvis's life. Why? Because it happened far from American media, far from the spotlight that had documented his every move since '56. Here in a foreign country during tense times, Elvis experienced something he hadn't known since childhood: relative anonymity. The German press knew who he was. European fans were aware. But the daily military rhythm created buffer between Elvis and constant attention. He could walk through small German towns without riots, eat at local restaurants without being mobbed, function in small but significant ways as a normal young man serving overseas. The army let Elvis live off base with his father and grandmother. This wasn't special treatment. Military regulations permitted it under certain circumstances. The family rented a modest house in Bad Nauheim. This became home for the deployment. Strange dynamic. Elvis reported for duty each day like other soldiers, worked his shifts, participated in training, fulfilled obligations. But evenings he returned to a home where he could process the loneliness of deployment, the grief over his mother, the uncertainty about whether his career would exist when he returned. Fellow soldiers paint a consistent picture: competent at assigned duties, friendly but not seeking attention, genuinely interested in doing his job properly. One soldier recalled Elvis asking detailed questions about vehicle maintenance, not just how to operate equipment, how it functioned mechanically. He wanted to understand. His fame still created complications sometimes. Word would spread that Elvis was in a particular town. Crowds would gather. German teenagers loved rock and roll too, but the frequency was much lower than America, and military structure provided protection civilian life hadn't. Elvis started exploring German culture, learned basic phrases, tried local food, visited historical sites on leave. People who knew him then say he was genuinely curious about the country where he was stationed, treating deployment as opportunity to experience different culture, not just military obligation. It was in Germany that Elvis met Priscilla Beaulieu, 14 years old, daughter of a US Air Force officer, first meeting at a party at Elvis's house in Bad Nauheim, September '59. This relationship would become controversial by modern standards, the age difference, the power imbalance. But it was the beginning of a connection that would profoundly affect both their lives. The isolation of overseas service combined with ongoing grief created deep introspection. Letters from this period suggest Elvis was struggling with huge questions. Would fans still care when he returned? Had 2 years away destroyed the momentum? Would he return to find the world had moved on? Colonel Parker, back in America, worked to keep Elvis's name alive. RCA released previously recorded material. Studios announced future projects. Fan clubs organized welcome home campaigns. But Elvis in Germany was separated from all that machinery, living in strange liminal space between fame he'd known and uncertain future waiting. March 5, 1960. McGuire Air Force Base, New Jersey. The transport plane landed. Media from across the country waiting. Cameras captured Elvis, still in uniform, still Sergeant Presley after his final promotion, stepping onto American soil. The press conference was carefully orchestrated. Colonel Parker had been planning this moment for months. Reporters asked about military service, Germany, future plans. Elvis answered politely, professionally, giving nothing away about whatever internal transformation had occurred. But people close to him noticed immediately. Something had changed, a weariness that hadn't been there, guardedness in interactions, suggesting the separation had given him perspective on what fame actually meant. He was still polite, gracious with fans, but there was distance now, protective barrier, official discharge same day. After 2 years proving he could function as regular soldier, complete assigned duties, maintain dignity despite media attention, Elvis was free to return to his career. Question was, would that career still exist? Had 2 years away destroyed everything? Parker had a plan. Within weeks, Elvis was in Nashville recording. The sessions produced some of his most commercially successful work. Stuck on You reached #1. The album Elvis Is Back demonstrated his voice, his style, his appeal remained intact despite absence. But there was a shift in how Elvis approached his career now. The raw, rebellious energy of early performances was tempered. He was older, had experienced real loss, had lived outside the fame bubble, had seen how life continued for ordinary people while he was away. This perspective influenced his artistic choices and public persona. Hollywood welcomed him back eagerly. GI Blues, released October '60, capitalized on his military service by casting him as soldier in Germany. Commercially successful, box office appeal remained strong. But it represented shift towards safer, more family-friendly content that would characterize most of his film work through the '60s. Some critics and early fans lamented this change. They wanted dangerous Elvis, the one who shocked audiences and challenged norms. But the Elvis who returned seemed less interested in rebellion, more focused on longevity, building sustainable career that could survive beyond teenage novelty. Behind professional success, Elvis was processing complex emotions about fame, identity, purpose. According to the Memphis Mafia, Elvis talked about military service with genuine pride. He'd proven something to himself, something gold records couldn't prove, that he could do difficult things, sacrifice for something larger than career, that he was more than just famous face, but he also struggled with reintegration into celebrity machinery. After 2 years of relatively simple routine, where his job involved clear duties and straightforward expectations, returning to complicated entertainment management, contract negotiations, PR strategies, felt disorienting. He had to relearn how to be Elvis Presley, the performer, after being Sergeant Presley, the soldier. His relationship with Colonel Parker became more complex. According to observers, Elvis seemed less deferential after returning, asked more questions, pushed back on certain choices, expressed opinions about career direction with more confidence. Military experience had given him different kind of authority, one based on succeeding in an environment where fame offered no advantage. 2 years away affected his relationship with fans too. Letters that poured into Graceland during service revealed depth of loyalty. They'd waited. They'd supported him. They'd proven fame built on genuine talent could survive interruption. This knowledge gave Elvis different understanding of his audience. They weren't just consumers of image, they were people who'd invested emotionally in his success. But there was loss in this transition. Spontaneity and creative experimentation that characterized early career became increasingly difficult as career became more structured, controlled, oriented toward reliable commercial success rather than artistic risk. The Elvis who returned from Germany was more professional, more disciplined, more aware of the business of being Elvis Presley. This brought stability and financial success, but something irreplaceable had been traded away. Here's what most people miss about Elvis's military service. They treat it as footnote, 2-year interruption in otherwise continuous rise to superstardom. But that perspective misses everything crucial about what those 2 years revealed and what they cost. When Elvis chose regular soldier over special services, he was making statement about who he wanted to be beyond fame, asserting that character mattered more than career advancement. That proving something to himself was more important than maintaining constant public visibility. This choice came with real risk. Music industry in late 50s was rapidly evolving, new artists emerging constantly. 2 years away could have ended many careers. But Elvis's service demonstrated something about genuine fame versus manufactured celebrity. The loyalty of his audience, Their willingness to wait, their continued interest despite his absence proved what he'd built wasn't novelty or temporary fascination. It was real connection between performer and audience, strong enough to survive interruption. The personal cost was significant. His mother's death during service created grief Elvis carried the rest of his life. People close to him in later years heard him talk about Gladys constantly, wishing she could have seen his continued success. The hole her absence left that nothing, not fame, not wealth, not adoration could fill. The timing, her dying while he was away serving, added layers of guilt to natural grief. Military service changed Elvis's relationship with authority and structure. Having functioned successfully within rigid army hierarchy, following orders, completing duties without special treatment, gave him different perspective on discipline and responsibility. This influenced how he later managed career, worked with musicians and film crews, understood difference between creative freedom and professional obligation. Germany specifically, being stationed overseas during Cold War, exposed Elvis to geopolitical realities most entertainers never directly encountered. He served during genuine international tension. American soldiers in Germany maintained readiness for potential Soviet conflict. His specific duties didn't involve combat, but broader context was serious and consequential. This gave him perspective on what real service meant, what real sacrifice looked like. Several things become clear looking back. First, Elvis's choice to serve as regular soldier was genuinely unusual for someone at his fame level. He could have avoided service entirely through various means, could have accepted special assignment more comfortable and aligned with career interests. That he chose neither reveals integrity. Fame often obscures. Second, the cost extended beyond obvious career interruption. It meant being away from his mother during final year of her life, missing creative opportunities, watching music industry evolve without his participation, risking his audience would move on, that newer artists would replace him. That fame was too fragile to survive absence. Third, his successful return demonstrated something important about relationship between authentic talent and sustainable fame. Elvis wasn't just manufactured image or temporary trend. He had genuine ability, genuine connection with audiences, genuine charisma, transcending celebrity machinery. Two-year test proved this in ways continuous success never could. But perhaps most significantly, Elvis's military service illustrated fundamental isolation of fame. Even while serving alongside other soldiers, sharing their duties and conditions, Elvis remained separate. His celebrity was inescapable. Fellow soldiers saw him differently. Officers were aware of PR implications. Media tracked every move, even from Germany. The uniform couldn't completely dissolve barrier between Elvis and normal life. This realization, that fame created permanent separation from ordinary human experience, affected Elvis profoundly. People who knew him well in later years say he often talked about military service with nostalgia. Describing it as one of last times, he felt genuinely useful doing something that had nothing to do with being Elvis Presley. The work was straightforward. Expectations were clear. Success meant completing assigned duties competently, not entertaining millions or maintaining image. The lessons extend beyond Elvis's individual story. They speak to fundamental questions about fame, service, sacrifice, integrity. What do we owe beyond our own success? How do we maintain character when surrounded by people willing to excuse our every action because of status? How do we prove to ourselves we're more than the image others created around us? Elvis answered by choosing service over convenience, insisting on equal treatment when special privileges were offered, completing difficult duties that offered no career benefit. These choices didn't make headlines like performances, didn't generate excitement of concerts or profit of films, but they revealed something essential about human being behind phenomenon. In later years, as Elvis struggled with pressures of sustained fame, with health issues and personal challenges that eventually shortened his life, those who remembered his military service pointed to it as evidence of fundamental decency. Here was proof that beneath costumes and performances, beneath mansion and entourage, beneath all machinery of celebrity, there had been a young man willing to sacrifice his own interests for something he believed was right. Elvis's military service isn't about traditional heroism. He didn't fight in combat, didn't save lives or perform extraordinary valor, but he did something perhaps more difficult for someone at his fame level. He chose ordinariness when extraordinary privilege was available, chose duty when escape was possible, chose to prove his character when simply maintaining image would have been easier. That choice, made by a 23-year-old who owned the world and voluntarily set it aside, tells us more about Elvis Presley than any number of gold records or sold-out concerts. It tells us he understood something profound about what it means to be human, about difference between who we appear to be and who we actually are, about courage required to test ourselves outside protective bubble of fame and privilege. So what does this mean for us? What can a decision made in 1958 teach us today? Maybe it's this: integrity isn't about grand gestures. It's about choices we make when easier options are available. It's about knowing difference between what serves our image and what serves our character. Elvis could have avoided service, could have accepted comfortable assignment protecting his career. That he chose differently reveals something worth remembering about what matters beyond success. He chose to know himself, to test himself, to prove he was more than the fame surrounding him. And he paid for that choice with his mother's life, with 2 years of career momentum, with certainty about his future. But he gained something too. He gained knowledge that he could do hard things, that he was real, that underneath all the screaming fans and gold records, there was still a person capable of sacrifice and duty and integrity. That knowledge stayed with him. Even when everything else fell apart, he knew he'd made that choice. He knew what it had cost him, and he knew it had been worth it. Thank you for staying with this story, for caring about the human being behind the legend, for wanting to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who appreciates real history told honestly. And remember, the most interesting stories are often the quiet choices that reveal who someone really was when the world wasn't watching. Until next time.